On a cold November day, in 1957, police officers in the small, quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, made a grim discovery that would horrify the nation. Inside a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town, they uncovered a scene so grotesque and so utterly inhuman. There were chairs upholstered in human skin, skulls used as soup bowls, a box filled with noses, and masks, not made of plastic or rubber, but of real, human faces. At the center of this horror was a man few suspected, Ed Gein, a soft, spoken handyman who lived alone and kept to himself. But behind his quiet demeanor hid the mind of a disturbed killer, a man whose obsession with his dead mother and hatred for women would drive him to dig up grave and later take lives. Ed Gein's crime shocked a post-war America, still clinging innocence for healing the community, and in the years that followed, his story became legend. He would go on to inspire some of the most terrifying villains in horror film history. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. But before he was a monster, he was a boy, and his descent into madness began long before the world ever heard his name. This is the true story of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. A monstrous childhood. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. Outwardly, his family appeared typical, but inside there was a world ruled by dysfunction, silence, and religious fear. His George Gein was once a carpenter and tanner, but years of alcoholism had reduced him to a broken, bitter man. He drifted from job to job, unable to provide or connect with his family. Augusta, his wife, openly despised him. She called him lazy drunk, incompetent failure, and made sure their son saw him as weak and shameful. George had no authority in the household, just a corner of the room and a bottle in his hand. The true power in the home was Augusta. She wasn't just religious, she was fanatical. Her view of the world came from a harsh, punishing form of Lutheranism. She believed the world was filled with sin, and that all women, aside from herself, were corrupt and dangerous. To her, lust was the original sin, and women were its agents. Augusta's contempt extended beyond George. She began to resent her older son Henry, especially as he grew older and challenged her beliefs. Henry doubted her dogma and even began dating a local woman. Something Augusta saw as betrayal. A son who questioned her was no longer a son, but a threat to her control. Ed, however, remained obedient and quiet. He clung to every word his mother spoke, accepting her teachings as absolute truth. While Henry rebelled, Ed withdrew further into Augusta's world, a place ruled by judgment, shame, and fear. To him, Augusta was not just a parent, she was a prophet, the one righteous voice in a world of evil. Even as her sons entered their 30s, Augusta continued to isolate them from the world, treating them not as grown men, but as helpless children who could never be trusted to think or live for themselves. In 1915, Augusta moved the family to an isolated farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The goal was clear: to shield her boys from outside influence. The boys were kept under strict control. No friends, no fun, no girls. Even Ed still warned them, every stranger was a tool of the devil. Ed grew up isolated and emotionally stunted. He was shy, soft-spoken, and strange. At school, other kids bullied him for his vacant stares and odd behavior. But no matter how cruel the outside world was, Ed always returned the same, his mother's grip. After George Gein passed away in April 1940, there was no mourning in the household. His death was not a tragedy. It was a quiet erasure. Neither Augusta nor Ed shed tears. In fact, it was whispered, even by those who knew the family, that they had prayed for this moment every day. George had become a burden, a stumbling, drunken shadow of a man who had long lost his place in the home. And with his absence, the Gein household became quieter, and Augusta became infinitely more dangerous. Now, the family consisted only of Augusta, Ed, and his older brother Henry. But even then, the balance was tenuous. Henry, unlike Ed, had gunned away from their mother's suffocating grip. Henry had even started a romantic relationship with a woman in town. a single mother. Something that Augusta viewed, not just as disappointing, but as a direct betrayal. To her, this woman was a whore, and Henry, by extension, was corruptible. She began to turn against him, criticizing the same way she had once criticized George. Her love, if it had ever existed for Henry, was quickly replaced by resentment. Ed, on the other hand, remained fiercely loyal. He had no doubts, no desires beyond pleasing his mother. He listened to her sermons, obeyed her commands, and absorbed her worldview as gospel truth. Where Henry saw Augusta's fanaticism as dangerous, Ed saw it as sacred. After George's death, Ed's relationship with his mother became increasingly strange. Isolated from the world, Augusta began treating Ed more like a companion than a son. There were disturbing signs that their bond had crossed a line. Emotionally, Henry noticed. He grew uncomfortable with their closeness and openly criticized Augusta's influence over Ed. He warned his brother that their mother was manipulating him, warping his mind. Then, in May 1944, a fire broke out on the Gein property. Ed later told police he and Henry were burning brush when the flames got out of control. He claimed he lost sight of his brother in the smoke. Henry's body was found face down in a clearing. Strangely, there were no major burns, only a large bruise on the back of his head. The cause of death was ruled as smoke inhalation. No autopsy, no investigation. Many believe Ed killed Henry either out of rage, fear, or to protect his twisted bond with their mother. Others think Augusta encouraged it, seeing Henry as a threat. What's certain is this: after Henry's death, Ed and Augusta were alone. Completely. No more outside influence. No more witnesses. And from that moment on, Ed's world grew darker by the day. The isolation begins. Augusta Gein died in December of 1945, following a second stroke that left her weak and bedridden for months. For Ed, it was the most devastating moment of his life. His world, already small and twisted, collapsed entirely. Augusta had raised Ed to believe that the world was evil, and that only she could protect him from it. Without her, he was adrift, directionless and emotionally paralyzed. Ed once described her death as losing everything I ever had. He wasn't exaggerating. Augusta wasn't just his mother. She was his entire universe. In the weeks after her passing, Ed closed off the parts of the house she had used. He boarded up her bedroom, sealing it like a shrine. Everything inside, her Bible, furniture, even the curtains, remained untouched, frozen in time. The rest of, however, descended into filth. Ed moved into a small back room off the kitchen, where he lived among piles of newspapers, rotting food, and discarded junk. The once orderly farmhouse became a den of decay and delusion. Now completely alone, Ed began to unravel. He immersed himself in pornographic magazines, pulp horror novels, and medical books, particularly those focused on female anatomy and Nazi medical experiments. He spent hours reading about grave robbing, embalming, and taxidermy. His fascination with bodies and women raised in dark. By 1947, Ed had started visiting cemeteries at night, especially after funerals. In her confessions, he claimed to fall into trances, waking up in graveyards without remembering how he got there. But no one trusted him, because he was there to look for something. Ed began digging up freshly buried women, often middle-aged, stout, and resembling Augusta. He would carefully exhume their bodies, remove selected parts, heads, genitals, skin, and then return the mutilated remains to their graves. At first, he tried to rebury what he didn't use, but over time, even that effort faded. He brought more and more of the remains home, storing them in boxes, bags, and jars. In the solitude of his farmhouse, Ed began to batch the women's skin to make masks, gloves, lampshades, and even furniture. He preserved their skulls, used bones for tools, and hung faces like trophies on the walls. His interest wasn't purely sexual. It was psychological, symbolic. Ed wasn't trying to conquer these women. He was trying to become one of them. More specifically, become his mother. Ed later admitted that he created a full woman suit, crafted from real human skin, which he would wear at night. Sometimes he'd dance in the moonlight wearing it, pretending to be Augusta. He wasn't just honoring her memory. He was trying to bring back, to step into her identity, to make her live again through him. Despite these horrifying behaviors, Ed still managed to function in public. He worked odd handyman jobs around town, helped neighbors, and even babysat children. Many in Plainfield saw him as odd, but harmless. No one imagined the truth. The murders. As Ed's obsession with death deepened, the line between the dead and the living began to blur. Grave robbing was no longer enough. His fantasies demanded more. On December 8, 1954, Ed committed his first known murder. Mary Hogan, 54, ran a small tavern in Pine Grove, about 10 miles from the Gein farm. She was brash, outspoken, and bore a striking resemblance to Augusta. That morning, Ed walked into the tavern with a .32 caliber pistol, shot Mary Ed, and dragged her lifeless body through the snow. He loaded her onto his sled and took her back to the farm. No one witnessed the crime. The only clue was a pool of blood at the tavern. For years, her disappearance remained a mystery. Strangely, Ed didn't hide it well. To neighbors, he casually joked, "She's not missing. She's not place." Most people laughed it off, thinking he was just being weird old Ed. Over the next 3 years, Ed's behavior grew more disturbing. He stopped returning bodies to their graves, choosing instead to keep the entire corpse. He crafted masks from human faces, belts from human nipples, and a full woman suit from ditched skin. Locals recalled that Ed often handed out packages of meat, claiming it was venison. But Ed never hunted. After his arrest, many began to suspect the unthinkable, that they had eaten human flesh. In November 1957, Plainfield turned quiet for hunting season. Most people were out in the woods, leaving the town nearly empty. Ed saw his chance. On the morning of November 16, he walked into Worden's hardware store, where Bernice Worden, 58, was working alone. He asked about antifreeze, then waited until she was alone, and shot her with a .22 rifle. He dragged her body out the back door, loaded into her own truck, and drove off. It was broad daylight, but with the town empty, no one saw a thing. By 5 p.m. that evening, Bernice's son, Deputy Frank Worden, grew concerned. He went to the store and found the door unlocked, and a trail of blood on the floor leading out into the snow. The last receipt in the sale listed one name, Ed Gein. Frank called for backup. That night, police went looking for Plainfield's strangest resident. And what they found would haunt them forever. Arrest and trial. When police arrived at Ed Gein's remote farmhouse on the cold night November 16, 1957, they were prepared to question him about the disappeared Bernice Worden. What they found instead would shock the nation and forever redefine the meaning of horror. Inside a shed near the house, they discovered the mutilated corpse of Bernice. Her body was hanging upside down from a wooden beam, gutted from her chest to her pelvis, the way one would dress a deer. Her head had been moved. In the kitchen, officers found her heart, sitting in a metal pan on the stove, as if Ed had been preparing to cook it. The house itself was far worse. Every room they searched revealed scenes more disturbing than the last. There were chairs and lampshades made of human skin, a belt sewn from human nipples, bowls fashioned from human skulls. They found a box full of noses and another containing female genitalia. Dozens of human face masks hung like grotesque trophies on the walls, some of them still with hair attached. In a brown paper bag, they found the severed head of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had vanished 3 years earlier. Perhaps the most chilling discovery was a full bodysuit, stitched from the skin of several women. Ed had crafted it to wear, complete with preserved breasts and a mask. Later that evening, police found Ed walking out of a grocery store. He seemed confused, as if nothing had happened. But when brought in for questioning, he quickly confessed to the murders of both Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, as well as years of grave robbing. He admitted to targeting recently buried women who resembled Augusta, reading obituaries to find his next materials, and visiting cemeteries at night to exhume their bodies. Ed was brought before the 21, 1957. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. A few months later, in January 1958, doctors ruled him mentally unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. There, he was described by staff as quiet, respectful, and oddly man who showed no signs of the monstrosity he had committed. For 10 years, Ed remained in the hospital, largely forgotten by the public. Then, in 1968, doctors declared him competent to face trial. He was brought to court and charged with only one murder, that of Bernice Worden. The state chose not to pursue the second charge, believing that one conviction was sufficient. On November 14, 1968, Ed Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder. However, the court once again ruled that he had been legally insane at the time of the crime. Instead of prison, he was returned to state care, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, from complications related to lung cancer. He was 77 years old. His body was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, just a few yards from the graves he had once desecrated. In 2000, his headstone was stolen. A fittingly eerie end for a man whose life blue line dined between death and obsession. With a body count in the double digits. In fact, he was only convicted of a single murder. But the horror he unleashed, the legacy of what he did to the dead, has haunted America for decades. The victims may be buried, but the scars he left on their families, on his community, and on our collective psyche remain. Someone said, "Imagine being just a small town cop and walking into that house. One day you're chasing chickens off a farm, the next, you're inside hell." Another added, "The twin demons of alcoholism and religious fanaticism raised a monster. But he was still a boy once. One that never had a chance." Ed Gein wasn't born evil. He was raised in isolation, under the crushing weight of a mother's twisted belief the world, especially women, were evil. He was never taught to think for himself, to feel love without guilt, or to see others as human. More comment told that. Abusive mother and childhood isolation. He never stood a chance. And yet, the lesson here is not just about Ed. It's about community, about how monsters are not always born. They're built. Built by neglect, by fanaticism, by the failure to intervene before it's too late. Ed Gein serves as a grotesque warning, not only of what can happen in the shadows, but of what can grow in plain sight when no one is paying attention. The question now is not just how we remember Ed Gein. It's how we stop creating the next one.